Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to share a shocking story about what happened when my blind parents came to visit me at my new home, and how the local HOA Karen completely humiliated herself after calling the police on them simply for wearing dark glasses. Let me introduce myself. I'm Sarah Johnson, a 30-year-old elementary school teacher. I moved into Sunnyvale Gardens about 6 months ago after accepting a position at the local school district. My parents, Robert and Ellen Johnson, were excited to finally visit and see my first home. Some background about my parents that's important to this story. Both of them are legally blind. My father, Robert, is 62 years old and a retired Army veteran. He lost his sight during his service overseas when an IED exploded near his patrol. Despite this challenge, he's remained incredibly independent and positive. My mother, Ellen, who's 60, has a degenerative eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa that began affecting her in her 30s. Over the years, her vision gradually deteriorated, and now she can only perceive vague shapes and changes in lighting. Both my parents wear special dark protective glasses whenever they're outside. These aren't just regular sunglasses, they're medically prescribed to protect their sensitive eyes from light that can cause them pain and further damage. Dad's are completely dark, while Mom's have a special amber tint designed for her specific condition. They both use white canes to navigate, and they've become experts at maintaining their independence despite their disabilities. I was so excited to have them visit my new home, and I spent weeks making sure everything was accessible for them, adding textured markers at steps, clearing pathways, and describing the layout of each room so they could navigate comfortably. Little did I know that their visit would turn into one of the most infuriating and ultimately satisfying confrontations I've ever experienced, all because of an HOA representative who couldn't mind her own business. Before I tell you what happened with my parents, let me explain a bit about Sunnyvale Gardens and particularly about Deborah Miller, the 55-year-old self-appointed community standards enforcer of our HOA. Officially, Deborah was the vice president of the Homeowners Association, but unofficially she was the neighborhood watchdog who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from finding rule violations. When I first moved in, my realtor warned me that Sunnyvale Gardens had strict HOA regulations, but I figured they couldn't be that bad. I was wrong. Within my first month, I received a detailed binder containing 87 pages of community guidelines covering everything from acceptable mailbox designs to the exact shade of beige houses could be painted. Honestly, I hadn't even read through the entire thing by the time this incident occurred. My first encounter with Deborah happened just 2 weeks after moving in. I had parked my car in my own driveway, but apparently the front tire was exactly 4 inches onto the lawn instead of staying fully on the concrete. Rather than knocking on my door to mention it, Deborah took photos, filed a formal complaint, and had a warning notice mailed to me. The second run-in involved some marigolds I'd planted around my mailbox, which were non-approved flora, according to Section 23, Paragraph 7 of the guidelines. Sunnyvale Gardens had developed these strict rules because of a few break-ins that had occurred years ago. The community responded by implementing intense security measures, including a visitor registration policy. Technically, all visitors were supposed to be registered 48 hours in advance through an online portal, with their vehicle information and length of stay documented. For short visits, there was a visitor parking section near the community entrance where guests were supposed to display a temporary pass on their dashboard. I had tried to register my parents' visit, but the online system kept giving me error messages. After my third attempt, I gave up and figured I'd deal with any complaints if they came. My parents were only staying for the weekend, and they'd be using my guest room, not disturbing anyone. They arrived on Friday afternoon and I helped them get settled in. Dad was particularly interested in exploring my small backyard garden, which I described to him in detail over the phone. He loved gardening before losing his sight and still maintained a small herb garden at home using touch and smell to tend to his plants. Mom was excited to help me organize my kitchen, as she's an amazing cook even without her vision. On Friday evening, I gave them a detailed tour of the house, guiding their hands to important features, describing the layout, and helping them build a mental map. We set up tactile markers at steps and potential hazards, and I made sure pathways were clear of obstacles. We had a lovely dinner, caught up on family news, and went to bed early as they were tired from their 4-hour drive. Saturday morning started perfectly. The weather was beautiful, and I made my mom's famous blueberry pancakes for breakfast. My parents were eager to explore the neighborhood, so I planned a short walk around the community to help them get familiar with the immediate area around my house. I had no idea that this simple morning stroll would lead to such a dramatic confrontation, all because Deborah Miller couldn't recognize a disability when it was right in front of her face. After our Saturday morning breakfast, I needed to finish grading some student papers for Monday. My parents insisted I focus on my work while they enjoyed some fresh air in the backyard garden. My dad was particularly excited to explore the raised herb beds I'd planted, using his sense of smell and touch to identify the different plants. "Don't worry about us, sweetheart," Mom assured me. "We'll just be right outside getting some sunshine. Take your time with your work." They gathered their white canes and put on their protective glasses, Dad's completely dark ones that wrap around to block all light, and Mom's special amber-tinted ones that help with her specific condition. I helped them navigate through the sliding glass door to the backyard patio and made sure they knew the layout of the space. "The chairs are at 2 and 10 o'clock from where you're standing," I explained, using the clock face directions they prefer for navigation. "The garden beds are about 5 steps straight ahead, and there's nothing between you and them that you could trip over." They thanked me and settled in comfortably. Dad immediately made his way to the herb garden, while Mom sat in one of the patio chairs, tilting her face toward the warm morning sun. I watched them for a moment, smiling at how peaceful they looked, then went inside to tackle my grading. I'd been working for about 20 minutes when I heard an unfamiliar voice outside, speaking loudly and with obvious irritation. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor was having an argument, but then I recognized my father's calm, measured tone responding. I immediately got up and moved toward the sliding door, but what I saw through the glass made my blood boil. Deborah Miller was standing in my backyard, hands on her hips, glaring at my parents. She must have come through the side gate, which I'd left unlatched for easier access. She was wearing her typical uniform of pressed khaki pants and a polo shirt with the Sunnyvale Gardens logo embroidered on it, her graying hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. "I'm asking you one more time," she was saying, her voice dripping with suspicion. "Who are you and what are you doing lurking around this property?" My father, always the diplomat, had his white cane in one hand and was gesturing calmly with the other. "Ma'am, as I've explained, we're visiting our daughter Sarah. This is her home. We're just enjoying her garden while she works inside." Deborah's eyes narrowed as she looked them up and down. "I don't recall any visitor registration for this address. And why are you both wearing those dark glasses? It's very suspicious to hide your eyes like that when speaking to a community official." My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We're not hiding anything. We're both legally blind. These are medically prescribed protective glasses." Deborah scoffed audibly. "Convenient excuse. If you're blind, why aren't you looking at me when I'm speaking to you? And where's your identification?" Residents are required to register all visitors 48 hours in advance. I could see my dad tightening his grip on his white cane, a sign he was getting frustrated though his voice remained steady. "Ma'am, we don't make eye contact because we cannot see you. These white canes are mobility aids for the visually impaired. As for identification, our IDs are inside. Would you like us to call for Sarah?" "Convenient that you both claim to be blind," Deborah said with obvious disbelief. "I've been watching you moving around this yard quite comfortably. And I don't appreciate being lied to." I was about to slide open the door when Deborah stepped closer to my father, her face just inches from his. "Take off those glasses so I can see your eyes when you're speaking to me." That was when I flung open the sliding door and stepped outside. "What do you think you're doing in my backyard, interrogating my parents?" I demanded, moving quickly to stand between them and Deborah. Deborah turned to me, momentarily surprised, but quickly recovered her authoritative tone. "Sarah, you know we have strict visitor registration policies. I noticed these people moving around suspiciously and came to investigate. These people are my parents who I told you about last week when we spoke by the mailboxes," I said, trying to keep my voice level despite my anger. "And they are both legally blind, which should be obvious from their mobility canes and specialized glasses." Deborah's eyes flicked to the white canes, but she didn't back down. "Well, they should still be properly registered. And quite frankly, I find their behavior suspicious. They won't make eye contact, they're wearing dark glasses that hide their eyes, and they've been moving around the property examining things very closely." My mother spoke up, her voice tight with restrained emotion. "I'm Ellen Johnson, Sarah's mother. My husband Robert and I are both visually impaired. He lost his sight in military service, and I have a degenerative condition. We're not being suspicious, this is simply how we navigate the world." Instead of showing any empathy or recognition, Deborah's suspicion only seemed to increase. "If you're truly blind, why was he touching all the plants? And why were you turning your head as if looking around the yard?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Before I could respond, Deborah reached toward my father's face, attempting to remove his protective glasses. "Let me just see your eyes and we can clear this all up." When Deborah reached for my father's protective glasses, I stepped forward quickly, but Dad reacted first, jerking his head back and raising his hand defensively. "Please don't touch me," he said firmly, his military background evident in his tone. "These glasses are medically necessary. Removing them would cause me significant pain and possibly damage my eyes further." Deborah's face flushed with anger. "If you're really blind, you shouldn't have a problem proving it. I think you're using these glasses and canes as props to avoid following community guidelines." My mother stood up, her hand instinctively reaching out to find my father's arm. "That's completely inappropriate," she said, her voice trembling slightly with indignation. "No one has the right to demand we prove our disability. Would you ask someone in a wheelchair to stand up and prove they can't walk?" "This is different," Deborah insisted. "There's been a series of suspicious activities in the neighborhood lately. 2 weeks ago, someone was scoping out houses claiming to be delivering flyers. How do I know you're not doing something similar?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "They're in their 60s. Dad uses a cane. They're just sitting in my backyard." Deborah ignored me completely, her attention fixed on my parents. "If you're legitimate visitors, show me your identification right now." "Our wallets are inside," my mother explained, turning toward the house. "I'll go get them." That's when things truly escalated. As my mother attempted to walk past Deborah toward the sliding door, Deborah reached out and grabbed her arm, stopping her abruptly. "You're not going anywhere until this is sorted out," she declared. My mother gasped in surprise and pain. Deborah's grip was clearly too tight. Dad heard the sound and immediately sensed something was wrong. Despite his blindness, his instincts as both a husband and a veteran kicked in. He moved forward with surprising accuracy, positioning himself between Deborah and my mother. "Take your hands off my wife immediately," he said, his voice deadly calm but with an edge of authority that even Deborah couldn't miss. "You have no right to physically restrain her. Back away now." He was standing tall, white cane planted firmly on the ground, his military bearing evident in his posture. He wasn't touching Deborah or making any aggressive moves, simply creating a protective barrier between this woman and my mother. Deborah's eyes widened and she released my mother's arm, taking a step back. But instead of recognizing her overreaction, she immediately shifted to acting like the victim. "Are you threatening me?" she demanded, voice rising to a pitch that likely could be heard by neighbors. "Did you just threaten a community official?" "I did not threaten you," my father responded evenly. "I asked you to stop physically restraining my wife, which you had no legal right to do. You moved toward me aggressively," Deborah exclaimed, now clearly playing for an audience as a few curious neighbors had begun to peek over fences. "You raised your voice and invaded my personal space." I stepped between them, fury building inside me. "Stop this right now. You came into my backyard uninvited. You put your hands on my mother. And now you're accusing my disabled father of threatening you when he simply asked you to let go of her." Deborah pulled out her phone, fingers shaking slightly as she tapped the screen. "I'm calling the police. I don't feel safe with these unregistered visitors behaving aggressively on community property. This is my private property," I practically shouted. "Not community property." But Deborah was already speaking into her phone. "Yes, I need the police at 1542 Sycamore Lane in Sunnyvale Gardens immediately. I'm Deborah Miller, HOA Vice President. I've encountered suspicious individuals refusing to identify themselves, and now I'm being threatened. Please hurry." As she made this ridiculous call, I went to my mother who was rubbing her arm where Deborah had grabbed her. There was already a red mark forming that would likely bruise. Dad stood nearby, his jaw clenched in anger but maintaining his composure. "It's okay," I told them quietly. "Let her call. The police will sort this out and it won't be in her favor." Little did Deborah know, her impulsive call to 911 was about to backfire spectacularly. After Deborah finished her dramatic call to 911, we stood in tense silence in my backyard. I had helped my parents to the patio chairs where they sat close together, my mother still rubbing her arm where Deborah had grabbed her. Deborah positioned herself near the gate, as if standing guard to prevent our escape, though the idea of my elderly blind parents making a run for it was almost laughable despite the seriousness of the situation. "The police will be here shortly," Deborah announced with smug satisfaction. "Then we'll get to the bottom of who you really are and why you're trespassing in our community." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "They're not trespassing. They're my parents visiting me in my home, which I own. You're the one trespassing by entering my backyard without permission. As an HOA official, I have the right to investigate suspicious activity," she replied, though I noticed she took a small step back toward the gate. Being blind is not suspicious activity, I said firmly. And nothing in the HOA regulations gives you permission to enter private property without consent or to physically grab residents or their guests. While we waited, I quietly checked on my parents. Dad was outwardly calm, but I recognized the tight set of his jaw, the same expression he'd had when dealing with insensitive comments about his disability over the years. Mom was more visibly upset, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry about this," I whispered to them. "Not your fault, sweetheart," Dad replied softly. "Some people just can't see past their own assumptions." The irony of that statement from a blind man wasn't lost on any of us, and it brought a small smile to Mom's face despite the situation. It took less than 10 minutes for 2 police cruisers to arrive. From where we were in the backyard, I could hear car doors slamming and Deborah's voice as she rushed to meet the officers in the front yard, no doubt eager to present her version of events first. "Let me go talk to them," I told my parents. "I'll be right back." I walked around the side of the house to find Deborah animatedly talking to 2 officers, one older man with graying hair and sergeant stripes, and a younger female officer who was taking notes. Refused to identify themselves, and then the man became aggressive when I questioned them. Deborah was saying, "I'm concerned they may be casing houses in the neighborhood. We've had problems with burglaries in the past." The older officer noticed me approaching and held up a hand to pause Deborah's monologue. "Ma'am, is this your residence?" he asked me. "Yes, officer. I'm Sarah Johnson. I own this home. The people in my backyard are my parents, Robert and Ellen Johnson, who are visiting for the weekend. They're both legally blind, and this woman," I pointed to Deborah, "entered my backyard without permission, harassed them about their disability, physically grabbed my mother, and then called the police when my father asked her to let go." The female officer's eyebrows shot up. "The individuals in question are visually impaired?" "Yes," I confirmed. "They both use white canes for mobility and wear protective eyewear due to their conditions." The older officer's expression changed subtly. "White canes? Sir, I'd like to speak with everyone involved. Could you lead us to your backyard?" Deborah jumped in quickly. "They claimed to be blind, but they were moving around examining things very carefully. And they refused to show identification when asked by a community official." We walked around to the backyard where my parents were still sitting patiently. As soon as the officers saw them with their white canes and specialized glasses, I noticed an immediate shift in their demeanor. The older sergeant stepped forward. "Sir, ma'am, I'm Sergeant Wilson with the county police. This is Officer Ramirez. We received a call about a disturbance. Are you both doing okay?" My father nodded, his face turning toward the sound of the sergeant's voice, though his eyes, hidden behind his dark glasses, weren't focused on anything. "We're fine, officer, thank you. Just a misunderstanding, it seems." Sergeant Wilson studied my father for a moment, then asked, "Sir, if you don't mind my asking, are you Robert Johnson, formerly of the 82nd Airborne?" My father's expression changed to surprise. "Yes, that's right. Do we know each other?" The sergeant smiled. "I volunteer at the Veterans Support Center downtown. I've heard you speak at several events about adapting to vision loss after service. I didn't make the connection until I saw you just now. Your talks have helped a lot of our younger vets dealing with similar challenges." My father broke into a genuine smile for the first time since this ordeal began. "Small world, Sergeant. Glad to hear the programs are helping." Deborah stood frozen, her mouth slightly open as the realization dawned that she had not only harassed a disabled person but a respected veteran known to the police. Officer Ramirez turned to her. "Ma'am, did you physically restrain this woman?" She gestured toward my mother. I just lightly touched her arm when she tried to leave before identifying herself," Deborah stammered, her confidence visibly deflating. "Show them your arm, Mom," I said gently. My mother rolled up her sleeve to reveal the red marks that were now clearly forming into bruises in the shape of fingerprints. Officer Ramirez took photos while Sergeant Wilson asked my parents to explain what had happened from their perspective. They calmly recounted the events, from enjoying a peaceful morning in the garden to being confronted, accused of faking their disability, and physically restrained. Throughout their account, Deborah's face grew increasingly pale. By the time they finished, she was nervously fidgeting with the hem of her Sunnyvale Gardens polo shirt. "Do you have any identification with you?" Officer Ramirez asked my parents. "Our wallets are inside," my mother explained. "We didn't think we'd need ID to sit in our daughter's backyard." "I can vouch for their identity," I offered, "and I have my driver's license and mortgage documents inside that prove this is my residence." Sergeant Wilson nodded. "That would be helpful, Ms. Johnson." I went inside and quickly returned with my driver's license, property deed, and my parents' identification cards, including my father's VA ID that clearly indicated his disability status. Officer Ramirez reviewed them briefly and handed them back with a nod of confirmation to her partner. Sergeant Wilson turned to Deborah, his professional demeanor now noticeably cooler. Ms. Miller, I need to explain something very clearly. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act and state law, individuals with disabilities are not required to prove their disability to anyone, especially not random citizens or HOA representatives. The white canes these individuals are using are internationally recognized symbols of visual impairment. Deborah shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. I was just following our community safety protocols. We've had incidents. Furthermore, the sergeant continued, cutting her off, entering someone's private property without permission and physically restraining someone can constitute trespassing and assault. Mrs. Johnson has visible marks on her arm where you grabbed her. Officer Ramirez added, the fact that you attempted to remove Mr. Johnson's medically necessary eyewear could potentially be considered another form of assault, as it could cause physical harm. By this point, several neighbors had gathered near the fence line, watching the scene unfold. I recognized the Thompsons from next door and the elderly couple from across the street, all looking concerned and whispering among themselves. Deborah noticed them too and seemed to shrink even further. I was just doing my job as HOA vice president. We have strict protocols for unregistered visitors. Your job does not include the authority to physically detain people or enter private property without permission, Sergeant Wilson stated firmly. HOA regulations do not supersede state law or constitutional rights. Just then, a silver Mercedes pulled up in front of my house, and a distinguished-looking older man in a golf shirt hurried around to my backyard. I'm James Harrington, Sunnyvale Gardens HOA president, he announced breathlessly. I received several calls about a disturbance involving our VP. What's happening here? Before anyone could answer, he spotted my parents with their white canes and specialized glasses, then looked at the police officers and the growing crowd of neighbors. His face fell as he quickly put the pieces together. Oh no, he said quietly. Sergeant Wilson briefly explained the situation while James listened, his expression growing increasingly mortified. When the sergeant finished, James immediately turned to my parents and me. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Ms. Johnson, I cannot begin to express how deeply sorry I am for this inexcusable incident. This is absolutely not how Sunnyvale Gardens treats residents or their guests, especially not those with disabilities. His apology seemed genuinely heartfelt. He then turned to Deborah. Deborah, I need to speak with you privately after this. Please wait by my car. Deborah opened her mouth as if to protest but thought better of it and slunk away toward the front of the house. Officer Ramirez addressed my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, would you like to press charges for assault and battery based on the unwanted physical contact? My parents exchanged a meaningful look that they perfected over years of communication without visual cues. My father spoke first. We don't necessarily want to press charges if there's another way to resolve this, he said thoughtfully. What happened today reflects a much bigger problem: ignorance about disabilities and an abuse of authority. Perhaps there's a more constructive solution. James stepped forward eagerly. I assure you there will be consequences within our HOA structure. Effective immediately, Deborah will be suspended from her position pending a full board review. And I'd welcome any suggestions you might have about how we can better serve residents and visitors with disabilities. My mother nodded. Education would be a good start. Many people simply don't understand how to interact appropriately with visually impaired individuals. Perhaps some community awareness training. While this conversation continued, more neighbors had gathered. To my surprise, Mrs. Thompson from next door spoke up from beyond the fence. I saw the whole thing from my kitchen window, she called out. The way Deborah treated these people was disgraceful. I'm glad someone is finally standing up to her bullying. Several other neighbors murmured in agreement. It seemed Deborah had made quite a reputation for herself in the community, and not a positive one. By the time the police were ready to leave, having taken full statements and photographs of my mother's bruised arm, James had promised a complete overhaul of HOA practices regarding visitors and disabilities. He asked if my parents would be willing to attend an emergency community meeting to share their perspective on how the neighborhood could be more accessible and welcoming. We'd be happy to, my father agreed. We were only planning to stay the weekend, but I think we could extend our visit by a day or two for something this important. Over the next 3 days, the transformation in our community was remarkable. James organized an emergency HOA meeting where he publicly apologized to my parents and announced several immediate changes. 1. Deborah was permanently removed from her position after a unanimous board vote. 2. The visitor registration policy was revised to include reasonable accommodations. 3. The HOA would sponsor a community-wide disability awareness training. 4. A new accessibility committee would be formed to review all regulations for potential barriers. Most touching of all was how the neighbors rallied around us. Throughout the remainder of my parents' stay, people stopped by to introduce themselves, bring small gifts, and express their support. Mrs. Thompson brought over her famous apple pie. Mr. Garcia from down the street offered to install additional accessibility features in my home free of charge, and several families invited us for dinner. The day before my parents left, we attended the community meeting where my father gave an impromptu talk about living with blindness. The room was packed, with neighbors genuinely interested in learning how to be more respectful and supportive of people with disabilities. As for Deborah, she sold her house and moved out of the community within a month. Apparently, being known as the person who called the police on a blind veteran and his wife was too much public humiliation to bear. Sometimes it takes an awful incident to create positive change. What started as a traumatic confrontation ended up transforming our community for the better. And every time I see a neighbor helping an elderly visitor navigate our sidewalks or speaking respectfully to someone with a disability, I think maybe some good came from Deborah's horrible behavior after all. The best part? My parents now visit regularly without incident, and Dad has become something of a local celebrity with his gardening tips for people who want to create sensory gardens that everyone can enjoy, regardless of visual ability.